All right, today the topic is resurrection realization. We're going to cover the topic of the resurrection realizations. And there's a big difference between the resurrection appearance and the honest realization that the resurrection has actually happened. And what people think and what they believe are many times two different things. Luke 16:31 says, "And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead." See, what is Jesus going to have to do to persuade people to believe that he actually rose from the dead? 1 Corinthians 15, verse 16 through 20 said, "If corpses can't be raised, then Christ wasn't, because he was indeed dead. And if Christ weren't raised, then all you're doing is wandering about in the dark, as lost as ever. It's even worse for those who died hoping in Christ and resurrection, because they're already in their graves. If all we get out of Christ is a little inspiration for a few short years, we're a pretty sorry lot. But the truth is, Christ has been raised up, the first in a long legacy of those who are going to leave the cemeteries." See, because Christ was raised from the dead, we too will someday be raised from the dead. And watch how hard Jesus works to help people have their own personal resurrection realization. Now, the day he died, the sky was dark and cool, and Jesus had been savagely beaten and had been hanging on that wooden post at stake for about 6 hours. And then he belted out his victory psalm, Psalm 22, and his body fell limp. It was over. It was finished. And Jesus died about the same time that the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple. And at that very moment, an earthquake rocked Jerusalem. And amazed by the day's events, and especially because of the attitude from that man dubbed the King of the Jews, the Roman centurion gave Jesus a salutation that one would only give an emperor, of which they thought was a supernatural being. And most of the crowd departed at that point because the show was over. And it was time for most to go celebrate the Passover meal with their family and friends. It was time for the disciples to figure out what was going on. What just happened? Now what am I going to do next? And they'd been thinking, was he actually going to rise from the dead like he said he was going to? Was he really going to wake up from the dead like they'd recently witnessed Lazarus rising from the dead? Would there be a resurrection realization for them? So now the two burials. See, a man named Joseph from the city of Arimathea, he was a part of the leadership body of Israel, but he believed he was a closet disciple of Jesus, and he was a leader in that Sanhedrin. And he asked Pilate, who was the Roman leader, if he could take down and bury the body of Jesus before Passover happened. Now, Pilate didn't believe that Jesus was already dead, so he asked his centurion to walk about the 500 yards and give confirmation. He was dead. And at the centurion's command, the soldiers removed the post that Jesus was nailed to from its well-used crucifixion hole, and they wiggled loose the nails from the hands and the feet of Jesus, and they delivered Jesus' body to Joseph and his men, just as Pilate had instructed him to do. And Joseph and his servants then moved Jesus' body to an unoccupied, newly excavated tomb, which he personally owned. And because Joseph believed Jesus would rise again, he opted to forego the time and trouble of a traditional Judean burial with all the ceremonial cleaning and grave wrappings. Joseph simply wrapped Jesus in an expensive linen sheet and gently laid him in his tomb, and had his servants roll that heavy stone back across the entrance. And then he left. And a few women were there watching what Joseph was doing and how he buried Jesus. And they noticed he did it wrong. He did it improperly. And a fellow member of the Sanhedrin, a man named Nicodemus, who was also a closet believer in Jesus Christ, he saw it too. And so now Nicodemus had to work fast because it was only now a couple of hours unto Passover, and nobody could work after that point. And so he knew all the stores would be closed for 24 hours, so he wanted to get this done. And so he quickly rounded up some expensive spices and wrappings, and he had his men reopen Joseph's tomb, and then they ceremonially cleaned Jesus like they were supposed to, and they made his bloody, battered body look as good as it possibly could, covered it with these ointments, and then wrapped him from his neck down to his toes, in this burial cloth with these spices. And it all had to be done before sundown. Now the ladies had left. They were unaware of what Nicodemus had done. John 19:39. And there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Now 100 Roman pounds is about 72.5 U.S. pounds, just so you can know. And myrrh and aloe were, and still are, very expensive spices. And remember how the wise men how they bought those the spices and things when Jesus was first born. Well, it happened. It happened again, and so they had come to see him when he was a child, and now they came to see him again. So let me see here. See, Jesus was honored with these special pricey spices both at the beginning of his life and at the very end of his life. And a friend of mine who studied forestry told me that aloes is a potent member of the aromatic cedar family, and that the expensive resins had powerful scents, perfect to help mask the smell of death in a tomb. So John, because they didn't embalm bodies in those days. And so John 19:40, it says then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. See, Nick's men wrapped the body from head to toe in this cloth impregnated with about 72.5 pounds of fragrant resins. And it was thick, heavy, and it smelled amazing. Better than any closet. And then they respectfully tied a smaller cloth around his battered face. Verse 41. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never a man yet laid. And there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. It was close. So now sealing the tomb. And now it's Thursday. He had been crucified on Wednesday. And in the evening, when the sun goes down, that begins the next day to the Judeans. And so now starts this festival called Passover. So at sundown, Passover started till sundown the next day. And Matthew 27:62 says, now the next day that followed, the day of the preparation, which is Passover, the chief priests and the Pharisees came together unto Pilate. So now on the day they're not supposed to do anything, they go see Pilate, who's the Roman guy. And they just caused all this havoc. And now they go talk to Pilate, the Roman governor of that area. So Matthew 27:63, saying, Sir, we remember that the deceiver, this Jesus, said when he was yet alive, that after 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, he is risen from the dead, so the last error shall be worse than the first. Pilate said unto them, You have a watch. Go your way, but make it as sure as you can. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. And this was probably a watch of Roman guards. And these religious leaders didn't want anybody to steal the body and say, he's risen from the dead. They still don't want you to believe he's risen from the dead. And the Romans would typically post 4 men at that day and time. And these lowly Roman guards found Joseph's tomb, and they sealed the stone with a wax seal, and which made it illegal for anybody to touch it. It was officially sealed. And Pilate still had to play along with these religious leaders' troublemaking games. So now it's Saturday. A few days have passed. 3 days have passed, and it's about sundown. He's going to send in the angels. See, not much happened between his burial on Wednesday afternoon and Saturday afternoon, about 72 hours later. But things were about to get busy. And what Jesus had dreamed of since he was a child was about to really happen. 3 days earlier, when he was hanging there, he was absolutely sure that he was going to rise from the dead. We should be just about as sure that he rose from the dead. And we should be just as sure that we too will someday rise from the dead. Matthew 28, verse 2. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, and his raiment, his clothing, white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers, the guards, did shake and became as dead men. Now what a scene. These Roman guards, probably in full battle gear, because that's how they always had to stay dressed for battle all the time, were probably sitting there, bored out of their minds, swapping war stories. And they were only there to make sure that nobody stole that body. They had to sit there for over 2 days, almost 3 days. And remember, the Roman soldiers always had to carry with them enough food to get them through 3 or 4 days. So they were always prepared for something. Now all of a sudden the ground begins to shake and to tremble. And they see this glowing man glide down from heaven, total disregarding their official seal. And he alone rolled back that heavy stone, that door. And the guys may have seen some crazy stuff done in battle, but this was over the top. And in full view of the guards, this angel shoots down from the sky like lightning, rolls this large stone away from the opening like it was nothing, and then just sits down on it with a little grin. And these guards are speechless. And the angel glowed like lightning and was wearing clothing white as snow. And it was a little bit too much for these guys. So they faint. I guess when in doubt, pass out. And these soldiers were war hardened, but this was beyond crazy to them. They didn't have television and movies and things. They had never seen anything like this. They never imagined anything like this. No man, no spirit, nothing was going to stop the resurrection, and nothing was going to stop it from going public. See, nothing in the universe can stop you either as you learn to walk with power. When we realize the power of the resurrection, we too can be unstoppable. Now later that night, the guards had already come to and skulked off to craft whatever lie they were going to have to tell their commanding officer. And the ladies head to the grave in hopes of reburying Jesus properly. They did this sometime before sunup on Sunday. And one translation says that the women came in deep dawn. Deep dawn. And the ladies didn't know that Nicodemus had already reburied Jesus properly. They didn't know that the tomb had been officially sealed and was watched by Roman soldiers. They also didn't know that the stone had been rolled away by an angel and that Jesus had already risen from the dead. Were they in for a surprise? Mark 16:1. And when the Sabbath was past, early Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome had brought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. They thought they were going to bury him. Now the Gospel of Luke adds a fourth name, Joanna, and also says certain others. So there was at least 4 women that were here. 4 plus were in this group. And now verse 2 of Mark 16. And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And they said among themselves, Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of this sepulchre? As they were walking to this gravesite, they wondered who was going to roll that big heavy stone away. Just little old ladies like ourselves. How's it going to happen? And then they saw the effort that it took Joseph's crew to move that heavy thing 3 days before. And they were totally unaware. They were just walking there trying to figure out what they were going to do. See, the ladies forged ahead anyway, carrying their bucket of spice and their bundle of wrappings. And I think, in addition to this, if there's a will, there's a way. Sometimes you just have to go for something. They didn't know how they were going to move that stone, but for sure, they were going to make sure it was going to get moved. Just go for it sometimes. And then as you move, the doors are typically going to open. So now back to Mark 16, verse 4. And when they looked, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And entering into the sepulchre, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were affrighted. In most Bible records, the angels look just like humans, but with cleaner clothes. See, no place in the Bible does it say that angels have wings, but it does make for pretty pictures and jewelry. So verse 4, and he, the angel, said unto them, Be not affrighted. Ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. Behold, the place where they laid him. The angel gently taps on the hollow grave clothes that Jesus had been in, and they bend over and they look into that empty cocoon, and their eyes widen. What the? How crazy would that be? How did somebody pull them out of there how did they do it? They didn't get it. Verse 7, the angel, But go on your way and tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee, and there shall ye see him, as he said unto you. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, and they trembled and were amazed, neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. Who wouldn't be? How weird would that be? And this was a lot to take in. An angel, a hollow grave wrapping in the shape of a human body that smelled so wonderful. And these ladies ran like the wind to where the disciples' bed and breakfast was located. They had to tell somebody. So they told Peter. And the women ran back to tell Peter and the boys about the empty tomb and the hollow grave wrappings and the angel telling them that Jesus was missing. They still didn't believe he rose from the dead. The apostles thought that those emotional ladies were just making up another one of their tall, silly tales. And one of those women was actually the apostle James' mother. James didn't even believe his own mother. They're going, oh, God, come on, Mom. Come on. John 20, verse 2. Then she runneth and cometh to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and saith unto them, They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they've laid him. So they think he rose from the dead? They thought his body just got moved. What did the angel just tell them? He was what? He was risen. These women didn't believe their eyes yet, nor did they believe the angel, nor did they believe what Jesus said was going to happen to him on that day. What does it take for us to believe? Verse 3. Peter therefore went forth and that other disciple and came to the sepulchre. So they ran both together. And the other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. And he stooping down, he looked in and saw the linen clothes lying, yet he went not in. He just leaned over and looked in and saw those things. No body, just that mummified looking shape, that cocoon looking thing. Now, researchers think that this other guy was either Lazarus or the Apostle John. I don't know. John 20, verse 6. Then cometh Simon Peter, following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. Peter and the other guy, they run to this sepulcher, this grave. And Peter was not as fast as this younger guy. And the guy bends over and looks in, but Peter just pushes him aside and steps right into this thing. Just like the ladies had done. And he saw the grave clothes, that cocoon kind of looking thing, and the ointment covered shell in the shape of a body just laying there empty. And Jesus' new body had risen right through the 72.5 pounds of scented grave wrappings. Now the first resurrection realization. The other disciple believed at that point that Jesus rose from the dead. And he's the first one that had a resurrection realization. But he's not the first one to actually see the risen Christ. None of you have seen the Christ, maybe. But you believe he raised from the dead. This guy didn't even see and he believed. Verse 8 of John 20. Then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. For as yet they knew not the scripture that he must rise from the dead. They didn't get it yet. He did right then. And the other guy believed, but Peter still wasn't, he couldn't wrap his head around it. It was too much. How many times had Jesus said he was going to rise from the dead? Multiple times. For a whole year he'd been saying it, since the very beginning of his ministry. But just like you, this guy believed in the resurrection, never having seen the resurrected Christ. So don't be too hard on yourself if you don't yet see the deliverance that you're seeking. Keep moving until you figure out how to believe enough to receive. Jesus had to get them to the point they could believe that he actually and really and truly rose from the dead. Be patient with yourself. God's patient with you. God loves you. Now the first resurrection appearance. As Peter and the other guy leave, Mary Magdalene shows up at the sepulcher at that same time. And she's alone and tears are just pouring down her face. She'd probably been crying for the better part of 3 days. Verse 10 of John 20. Then the disciples went away again unto their own home. But Mary stood without the sepulchre weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the sepulchre. Now Mary Magdalene loved Jesus, but couldn't figure out what was going on here. She came back for a second look. Verse 12. And seeth two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the foot of where the body of Jesus had laid. Now there's how many angels? There's two. It doesn't say they were glowing. And they were sitting at both ends of this grave wrappings. Now verse 13 of John 20. And they said unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? What are you crying about? And she said unto them, Because they have taken my Lord away, and I know not where they've laid him. And she's talking to what she knows are angels. And the angel had already told her that Jesus was risen from the dead. And now she's still asking them where they've taken him. I love her spunk. You got to hand it to her. You know, it's funny, but I think what's funny is they were sitting in this tomb. And you got to think of a camera angle. And they're looking at her, looking into this tomb. And they could see what was happening right behind her. They could see who was standing right behind her. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing, and knew not that it was Jesus. And Jesus said unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? Isn't that what the angels had said? Whom seekest thou? Now she, supposing him to be the gardener, saith unto him, Sir, if you've borne him thence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I'm going to take him away. That's a lot to take in. And she's looking in, and there's two angels next to the grave wrappings. She turns around, and there's a man standing right behind her. How freaky would that be? You see? And maybe he was backlit because the sun was coming up. Maybe she couldn't see clearly because of all the tears in her eyes. You know, maybe he just looked a little different than the last time she saw him, because before he was a pretty beat up man. He wasn't a pretty sight. She doesn't recognize Jesus. Would you? I'm just wondering if some of those times you say that you've been helped by an angel, and many of you have told me this, you believe there's been angelic intervention. I'm wondering if that wasn't actually the Christ in a different form. It's possible. Did you know that? It's possible. Just food for thought. John 20, 10 through 16. And Jesus saith unto her, Mary! She turned herself and saith unto him, Rabboni, or Master! You know, what would it have actually been like when she realized who was actually standing there? Talk about drama. Talk about suspense. Talk about emotional appeal. This is where the TVs would have cut to commercial. When Jesus said her name in the way that only he said it, it clicked. Mary, Mary, Mary! Mary! Just the way that you have a pet name for somebody. He had one for her. He said it in just a way that only he says her name. Mary was the first person on earth to see the resurrected Christ. She wasn't the first one to realize it, though. You know, Mark 16:9 says he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devil spirits. Mary at one time had been a hot mess. And this woman was crazy thankful to Jesus for delivering her. Just like you are. He had totally changed his life, just like your life has been totally changed. She also must have been a special person in Jesus' life for her to have been the very first individual on earth to see him in his resurrected body. He didn't go to Peter first. Wasn't Peter his right-hand man? He went to Mary Magdalene. He didn't go to his mommy. She was there. She was somewhere in Jerusalem. He didn't go to his brothers. He went to Mary. She must have done something for him, you know, to bless him, for him to give her that special treatment. That was the first resurrection appearance and the second resurrection realization. Now, the second appearance on Sunday. Jesus then appeared to a few women as they too were heading to tell the disciples what Mary saw. They were excited. They believed Mary, they had seen some stuff too. And now, all of a sudden, Jesus greeted them by yelling out, all hail, or in our terms it would be, cheers! Imagine him just popping out of nowhere to these women who were also emotional and crying and going, cheers, ladies! Woo! You think having a new car, a new motorcycle, or a new boat is fun. Imagine a new body like that. I'm sure Jesus was having a blast seeing what it could do. He could be here, he could be over there, he could look like this, he could look like that. How much fun! How much fun is it going to be for us someday? These women just kneeled down and they grabbed his legs. They all wanted to hold him. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? They'd followed him off and on for a year. This was a second appearance in the third resurrection realization. Now the guards get bribed. About that same time, some of the guards, but not all of them, some of them had better ethics. These are the guys that they'd seen the angel, they'd passed out, the tomb got busted into, and they went back and they didn't go to Pilate. You know who they went to? They wanted some protection from the religious guys who started this whole mess. These guards knew those men knew how to manipulate Pilate. Because if you lost in that culture, at that day and time, if you're a Roman guard and you lost a prisoner, who knows what the punishment was? Death. Death. They took huge money to lie and say that somebody stole Jesus' body while they were sleeping. Now the third appearance. Now they had no resurrection realization. They just got some money. Now the third appearance and the fourth realization of the resurrection. Now Peter revisits the tomb alone this time. I mean, he's just shaking his head. He's like, I've seen Jesus do some crazy stuff, but I'm not getting this. And this is his second visit. He saw the risen Christ that time. And it says this in Luke 24:12 and 1 Corinthians 15:6-8. And he was still going to need a little more convincing. But this was Peter's resurrection realization. At least a starter realization. Because you'll see it took a lot more to get Peter to really realize this. Now the fourth appearance and the fifth resurrection realization. Jesus Christ comes up behind and between two disciples, friends of the apostles, who are walking home to a city called Emmaus after all the sad and the crazy events that had happened the last week. They'd been a part of the whole thing. They were disciples of Jesus. It was about a 15-mile walk directly west of Jerusalem, which would take between 4 and 5 hours at a casual pace. So they're walking, they're talking about the events of the day, and amazingly, as these disciples and friends of the apostles, all of a sudden somebody appears, walks up behind them and between them and starts talking. They don't recognize this guy. They don't recognize him. And they listen to this guy, who we know as Jesus, share from memory every single verse from the scrolls that pertain to the Messiah. How cool would that have been? Imagine the Christ sharing the word with you for 4 or 5 hours. Just imagine. You ever had somebody share the word with you and you're so blessed, you're just blessed out. You can't take much more. Imagine the Christ, 4 or 5 hours sharing the word with you. making things fit like they never fit before. OMG, they would have been texting. You see, they were blown away. You know, they all get to this house in Emmaus, and then they prepare a quick meal. The three of them, you see. And Jesus, the risen Christ, he grabs a piece of that flat bread, and he takes it, and he holds it, and he prays, and he breaks a piece off of it, and all of a sudden they go, bing, the light bulb pops. They realize this is the resurrected Christ. They had all heard about the memorial of communion that he did just a few days before. I'll bet Jesus repeated those words. This bread represents my body which was broken for your healing. Boom. Then they're like, what? What? What just happened? They had an amazing resurrection realization. Then they get up. They scurry. Jesus disappears at that point. They scurry back the 15 miles to Jerusalem to tell the apostles. Now, how much fun was Jesus having here? I'll bet he had fun. I bet he had a year of fun with his apostles and the disciples. I bet he's the coolest dude to hang out with. In that new body, you're still going to have your personality, the good part of it. You're still going to be you. Did you know that? You're going to be you forever. You're not going to be some robot with stubby wings. You see, the fifth and the final appearance and the sixth resurrection realization was on Sunday. And Jesus appears to 11 of the 12 disciples. Now, who do you think would be missing? The guy who betrayed him, Judas, at this point? Okay. Did he go out and kill himself at this time? It says 11, the Bible says there's 11 apostles there, but that's not true. It wasn't Judas who was gone. It was Thomas who was absent at this point. So if Thomas was absent and there were still 11 apostles there, who was at this meeting? Judas. Judas saw the resurrected Christ. Isn't that crazy? Judas saw the resurrected Christ appear in the middle of them in this room. 8 days later, Jesus appears a second time to the 11 apostles. Now this time, Thomas, or we'll call him Doubting Thomas, was present, which means who wasn't there? Probably Judas. And that's probably when he went and did the dirty deed and offed himself by impaling himself on a stake. That's what hanging meant at that day and time. It doesn't mean, so Jesus told Thomas to touch the holes in his hands and to thrust his finger into the wound into his side. And I'll bet Thomas did it. Wouldn't you have? Wouldn't you have at least touched it? You think it hurt Jesus to be touched at that point? No. He didn't look like a bloody mess. He just made his body look like he had the wounds like they were. So Thomas could believe. What will he do to help you believe even today? What do you need to believe for? Who do you need to believe with? Had to be amazing. This is the second time he showed himself. And I was thinking, where did Jesus get this ever-changing wardrobe? And Jesus did this thing just for Thomas. He was able to shape-shift himself to help Thomas and others believe. So what's your new body going to be able to do? I mean, you're going to have a body fashioned just like his someday. It's going to be flat out freaking amazing. And you know how long it's going to last you? Forever. How long is that? Forever. I think he is still able to be what we need him to be. What will he do to help you believe? What will he do to help you believe? Jesus, the resurrected Christ, has probably and most definitely touched each one of our lives more than one time. You think he's doing nothing? The way we touch his life now is by walking by the Spirit, by living the truth, and maintaining our resurrection realization. Now, other appearances happened over the next 40-day span. He appears to the 11 once again, but this time when they're in Galilee. They went back home. All the rest of those guys are from Galilee, except for Judas, and he's dead now. So they went back home. Is that what they're supposed to do? This whole year of training, was it just for fun? Just for giggles? You know? So they're in Galilee. That's 70 to 90 miles away, depending on which route you went. And some of his disciples still don't believe that he actually rose from the dead. Some of those apostles still don't believe that he actually rose from the dead. Now they've seen him 3 times in 3 different forms. What's it going to take to believe? What does it take to believe, to bring into existence something that never before has existed? They see him again in his resurrected body. It's just flat out amazing. Next to Peter. He appears to Peter and some of the boys who decide to go back into the fishing business. And he tells them, in no uncertain terms, stop fishing and get started feeding my sheep. Become fishers of men, so to speak. You know, take care of my people, like it says in John 21. And so they finally leave their nets, and they never go back. And they go to Jerusalem, where he had told them to wait for him. And then, now the 500. And you may not even realize this. Jesus appeared to 500 people on one occurrence, at one time. And it says that in 1 Corinthians 15, 4 through 8. 500 people saw him in his resurrected body at one meeting. Then the ascension happens. The ascension. That's 40 days after the resurrection. And Jesus appears to his disciples again after 40 days, and they're on the Mount of Olives, where all that trouble started, where he got captured that time. Probably the same area. Probably his favorite area to hang out on the Mount of Olives. Probably a pretty little place. Mount of Olives might have had olive trees. And an angel asks them, you know, all of a sudden they see him ascending, Jesus, they see him ascending, and the angel says, what are you guys looking at? What are you looking at? He's coming back. He's coming back. Get to work. And then James. At some point, Jesus appears in his resurrected body to his half-brother named James. The half-brothers of Jesus finally get it. They finally realize that Jesus is the risen Christ, the Messiah. They'd heard about him their whole life. They'd heard about all the amazing things their whole life, but they didn't believe. Mary and her boys had started hanging out with the apostles after the ascension, but before the day of Pentecost. You can read that in Acts 1 if you want. And how hard would it be to really believe that your big brother was in fact the Christ, and that your big half-brother Jesus had risen from the dead? Remember, not long ago, they thought Jesus was possessed and crazy, and they tried to abduct him from a meeting. Another verse says that they did not believe in him. They did not believe he was the Christ weeks before this. I ask you, what changed? What changed their minds? The resurrection is what changed their minds. The resurrection has changed everything. Everything's different. James finally got it. He had finally received his resurrection realization. And he wrote one of the books of the Bible in there, the one called James. And then Jesus even gave a resurrection appearance, and you're not going to believe this, but it's true, to a group of devil spirits. And I don't know about the timing of this one, but at some point, Jesus appeared to and told of his victory over death to a group of devil spirits, evil spirits who had been imprisoned and watched and not allowed to function since the flood of Noah. And that's about 2,400 years. Imagine not being able to work or do anything for 2,400 years, not to function. 2,400 years. Even they realized and even they believed that Jesus had raised from the dead. And the Bible says they trembled. James 2:19. And his rising up made them realize they were going down. His getting up meant they were going down. And they realized that they were going to have an end now. Whereas they'd been around, could have been millions of years. Who knows how long the angels have been around? We don't know. Nobody knows. How long's God been around? Don't think about that too much. Your head's going to start smoking, you know. You know. So now, all of a sudden, by his resurrection, they knew their time was limited because the Bible said it. If they realize they have an end, we realize we have a future. And that's the verses are 1 Peter 3:18 through 20, and then 2 Peter 2:4, and Jude 1:6. So finally, a few years pass, and Jesus appears once again to a man that was going to change everything. And this man that Jesus Christ chooses to appear to, and this is the last resurrection appearance listed in the Bible. But not the last resurrection realization in the Bible. This man was a hunter of Christians. He hunted them down and killed them. He hunted them down and killed them. He was a murderer of the family of God. And he did this for the same religious leaders that had attacked and murdered Jesus Christ. But Paul was changed. See, Paul was changed, you know, by this visit. And when his life was changed when he had his resurrection realization, when he realized who was talking to him on the road to Damascus, on his way to go murder some more Christians. Paul changed the way Christianity was done forever. And he, by revelation, molded Christianity into the secret dream that God had held since the foundation of the world, a dream called the Great Mystery. And while the rest of the apostles mixed legalism with truth and threw in a dash of walking by the Spirit, Paul was all in, and he did it exactly like God wanted him to do. Paul took Christianity to the world, not just to Israel. And Paul had his resurrection realization, and through his teaching and his words and his examples, it has helped billions of people get born again and become Christians. It helped billions of people over the last 2,000 years believe and live the Word, and it's helped many thousands learn to walk by power and to have the hope of knowing that they too someday will be raised from the dead. They're going to be forgiven from all their sins. They already are. But nothing's going to tie you down forever after that point. That stuff's in Acts 9 and 22. There's a big difference between a resurrection appearance and the honest, guttural realization that Jesus actually rose from the dead and is still alive almost 2,000 years later. Because he rose from the dead, we too will someday rise from the dead. We too are going to get up from the grave, no matter what you've done, where you've been or what you've seen. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we too can get born again and serve our purpose on earth now. And we're also, because He rose from the dead, we're going to look forward to the ultimate paradise of that new body, that new day and time that God designed specifically for you, for us in the future. Because we believe He is risen, let's enjoy our resurrection realization. God bless.